With only 20 seats on the Formula 1 grid, you'd think every driver on the grid would be the best in the world. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work. But if history has taught us anything, it's that talent isn't the only way to secure a spot on the grid. Sometimes a driver's biggest assets isn't their skill, it's the deep pockets they or their backers bring to the table. One driver that comes to mind is Nicholas Latifi. Between 2020 and 2022, Latifi suited up for 61 races and was out-qualified by teammates George Russell and Alex Albon a staggering 57 times. That's about 93.4% of the time, leaving him with a shockingly lopsided qualifying record and one of the worst head-to-head stats in modern F1. And yet, despite this notorious track record, Latifi isn't even the worst paid driver F1 has ever seen. Believe it or not, there have been drivers so underwhelming that the sport itself seems to have collectively buried them in forgotten archives. But today, we're digging up that buried history to unveil the worst paid driver F1 has ever known. Let's start with Gaston Mazzacane, the man affectionately, or perhaps mockingly, called the Flying Mullet. This nickname wasn't earned because of his speed on the track, but from his distinctive hairstyle, which was perhaps more impressive than his driving credentials. Thanks to the deep pockets of the Pan American Sports Network, Mazzacane landed a seat with Minardi for the 2000 season. This was a team notorious for taking on drivers with more financial backing than racing prowess. Mazzacane's F1 journey almost kicked off with a bang. In today's scoring system, he would have actually scored points in only his second race, the Brazilian Grand Prix. However, 2000 wasn't as generous with points as today's Formula 1, so his performance was officially labelled as pointless, a theme that would regrettably define most of his F1 career. The stats tell a brutal story across 17 races. He managed to out-qualify his teammate Mark Jean just 3 times. Even more telling, he finished ahead of Jean only once when both cars made it to the checkered flag. Throughout his entire career, his one moment of glory came at the US Grand Prix, where he pulled off an overtaking manoeuvre on the then reigning world champion, Mika Häkkinen, though this was less about skill and more about Häkkinen struggling on dry tyres in wet conditions. However, even this rare high point came with a downside. After briefly running in third place, thanks to others pitting, Mazzacane managed to turn his pit stop into a demolition derby, misjudging his entry speed and injuring 2 crew members in the process. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated his F1 career. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Despite his underwhelming performance, Mazzacane somehow secured a drive with Prost GP for 2001. Why? Well, money speaks volumes. However, the reality soon caught up. Mazzacane was consistently outpaced by his teammate, Jean-Deletraz, trailing by over a second per lap, which is like an eternity in F1 terms. After just 4 races, Mazzacane's F1 dream came to an abrupt, if not inevitable, end. And so, the Flying Mullet took his final bow, leaving behind a legacy as one of F1's most curious cases, a man whose hair had more fame than his stats. While Mazzacane's career was a disappointment, that of Jean-Denis Deletraz was an absolute catastrophe. You see, the 1990s were a golden era for paid drivers, with cash-strapped teams desperate for funding, but even those lowered standards, Deletraz stood out for all the wrong reasons. His F1 debut at the 1994 Australian Grand Prix reads like a comedy script. While Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill were battling for the World Championship at the front, Deletraz was creating his own drama by lapping almost 9 seconds slower than the leaders. To put that in perspective, he was essentially competing against no one. He was way behind everyone else. And then, the universe gifted us with one of F1's greatest ironies. Deletraz actually got a penalty for speeding, in the pit lane. That's right, the man who could barely keep up pace on the track somehow managed to break the limit where it didn't even count. When his race finally ended, he was 10 laps down. At that point, he wasn't just outpaced, he was on a sightseeing tour. But if that sounds like rock bottom, he weren't done yet. In 1995, Deletraz's family wealth secured him another shot, this time with Pacific Racing. At the Portuguese GP, he qualified a leisurely 12 seconds off pole. However, his race ended early when he reportedly felt unwell, though given the timing sheets, it was the car that looked truly sick. Deletraz's F1 adventure finally ran out of fuel and funds shortly after, prompting Pacific boss Keith Wiggins to deliver the brutal but honest assessment. He had defaulted on payment, and on ability alone, we're not prepared to keep him. When you're too slow, even for a backmarker team desperate for cash, you know you've reached a special level of underachievement. The next worst paid driver on the list is Ricardo Rosset. If Formula 1 had a textbook definition of persistent despite adversity, Ricardo Rosset's name would be front and centre. In 1996, Rosset landed at footwork alongside Jos Verstappen, Max's father. While Verstappen himself, no world beater, regularly extracted decent performances from the car, Rosset turned underperforming into an art form. Not only did he fail to finish half the races he started, but he also underachieved the impressive feat of qualifying behind Verstappen at every single event. Let that sink in. Not once did he outqualify his teammate across an entire season. But Rosset's story was far from over. In what could only be described as a masterclass in failing upwards, he somehow secured a drive with the ill-fated MasterCard Lola team in 1997. The term ill-fated might be an understatement. The team's F1 adventure lasted exactly one race weekend, where they failed to qualify before the whole project collapsed. Yet, somehow, like a phoenix rising from the ashes of mediocrity, Rosset found his way back to F1 in 1998 with Tyrrell. The irony is that he replaced the very same Jos Verstappen who had dominated him 2 years earlier, thanks to the substantial backing of his sponsors. But despite the backing, Rosset's struggles continued. He failed to qualify 5 times that season, in an era where most backmarkers at least managed to make it out on the grid. Rosset was a massive disappointment to everyone who had invested hugely in his F1 career. However, that can't be compared to Alex Yoong, who disappointed an entire nation. You see, F1 isn't just racing, it's a badge of pride. For countries with a deep-rooted F1 tradition, having a driver in the series is a bit like waving a flag on the world's most prestigious motorsport stage. So when Malaysia finally got his shot with Alex Yoong, they poured everything into him. But the story that unfolded wasn't quite the fairy tale they'd hoped for. Yoong's F1 journey kicked off in late 2001, when he replaced Tarso Marks at Minardi, making his Malaysia's first Formula 1 driver. The choice wasn't exactly down to Yoong's racing talent. Minardi was a team perpetually on financial fumes, and Yoong came with the lifeline they needed, substantial Malaysian backing. His debut at the 2001 Italian Grand Prix, which was 3 races to the end of the season, was more of a revelation than a celebration, just not in the way anyone had hoped. Paired with rookie Fernando Alonso, Yoong's first qualifying session at Monza looked like a study in sharp contrast. Both Minardis were at the back, but Alonso might as well have been on another track. He was a full 1.5 seconds ahead of Yoong. In F1, that gap is monumental. It's the difference between a race car and, well, a fairly sporty sedan. Yoong's debut ended with a spin on lap 44, a twist that felt almost symbolic of his entire F1 run. Constant reliability and mechanical troubles plagued his 3 races, and the season finale, he reached the checkered flag in 16th. The following year, after Alonso departed for Renault and eventual glory, Yoong got another teammate, a promising Australian named Mark Webber. What followed was less a rivalry and more a season-long demonstration of gulf between talent and money. Race after race, Webber didn't just outqualify Yoong, he made it look like they were competing in different categories. Yoong's F1 adventure soon ended after a series of poor performances. Also, the Malaysian support that had powered his entry into F1 somehow failed to keep up, and the sponsorship promises slowly ran dry. Fittingly, Yoong's time in F1 ended just as it began, more about the potential of promises than the power of performance. Yoong's F1 story shows that you can buy your way onto the grid, but you can't buy your way to the front of it. Another driver who learned that the hard way is Nikita Mazepin. Nikita Mazepin proves that even with decades of F1 evolution, some things never change. His journey to F1 was paved with his father's ukulele money, and sprinkled with just enough Formula 2 success to make it somewhat justifiable. Though finishing 18th while your teammate wins the championship isn't exactly a glowing recommendation. But in 2021, Mazepin made it to F1, and from his very first lap, he made sure the world would remember him, just not for the right reasons. He managed to spin off at turn 3 of his very first race in Bahrain, having already treated practice and qualifying as his personal spinning class. This set the tone for a season that would earn him the nickname Maze Spin, a moniker he lived up to with over 25 record spins during the year. The numbers tell a brutal story. His teammate Mick Schumacher constantly outqualified him, When Mazepin did finish ahead of Schumacher, which was a rare occurrence, it was usually by a few seconds. When Schumacher finished ahead, the gap was often over 30 seconds. The Mazepin-Schumacher partnership became increasingly tense, featuring highlights like Mazepin spinning Schumacher at Monza and a heart-stopping high-speed block at Zandorf. It was like watching a reality TV show when one contestant didn't quite understand the rules, or just chose to ignore them. The final twist in Mazepin's F1 tale came in early 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine led to sanctions under Russian entities and individuals. Has served ties with both Mazepin and Huracan, bringing an abrupt end to what was already a controversial F1 career. Now, let's talk about the driver with the title of the worst F1 paid driver in history. This driver's F1 stint was so shockingly bad that the FIA had to step in and revoke his licence. I'm talking about Yuji Ide. So, who exactly was Yuji Ide and how did he get to Formula 1? Well, back in Japan, Ide wasn't just any racer. He was actually considered respectable, coming off a strong season in Formula Nippon, now Super Formula, where he finished second in 2005. This was no small achievement. Formula Nippon is Japan's top single-seater series, the final step before F1. So when Super Aguri, a new Chinese team, wanted an all-Japanese lineup, Ide seemed like a logic, patriotic choice to partner with the more seasoned Takuma Sato for the 2006 season. But there was one major catch. Yuji Ide was already 31 years old by the time he got his F1 call-up. That's a ripe age for a rookie in a sport where drivers typically start young and come with years of training under their belts. Not only that, but Ide had barely spent any time in an F1 car before his debut, clocking only 200 kilometers of testing before his first race weekend. To put that in perspective, most drivers rack up thousands of kilometers in testing before they're unleashed on the grid. So, the minimal experience in the car, limited English skills to communicate with the mostly non-Japanese teams, and the immense pressure of an F1 debut, Ide's journey was off to a rocky start. Right from the start, it was clear things weren't going well. During his first 3 race weekends, Ide looked visibly out of sync. Other drivers were smoothly flowing race lines. Ide, on the other hand, seemed to be improvising, spinning off track and awkwardly drifting in and out of position. He quickly gained a reputation as unpredictable, and fellow drivers were unsure how to race him safely. Even Aguri Suzuki, the team's boss, who had been his strongest advocate, was forced to admit Ide's understanding of the car was shaky at best. The breaking point came during the San Marino Grand Prix. Ide collided with Dutch driver Christiaan Albers, causing a frightening crash that flipped Albers' car and left it upside down in the gravel. It was a scene straight out of a racing nightmare, and the FIA wasn't about to let it slide. They took matters into their own hands, intervening to remove Ide from the driver lineup. In a rare move, they stripped him of his FIA Super licence, essentially banning him from competing in Formula 1. With Ide out, Super Aguri scrambled to find a replacement, eventually calling up Frank Montague to fill in for the next few races. And just like that, Yuji Ide's F1 career was over after only 4 races, one of the shortest, most infamous stints in the sport's history. And there you have it, worst paid drivers in F1 history. Now, we want to hear from you. Which other paid driver do you think should have made this list? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our amazing content. See you next time.